The plains stretched out like a wound that never healed, raw, endless, and aching beneath a sky the color of bruised copper. The wind moved slow across the land, carrying with it the taste of dust and silence, the kind that settles deep in a man's bones until even memory forgets how to speak. The sun had begun its slow descent, bleeding red light across the dry ribs of the earth. Old fence posts leaned like tired soldiers, and the grass, what little was left of it, whispered secrets to the wind that no one stayed long enough to hear. Out beyond the horizon, a single raven circled, black against the burning dusk, the only thing alive enough to move in that stillness. It was the kind of evening that made time stop pretending to matter. The kind where even the land seemed to remember the weight of everything it had buried. Names, sins, prayers, all swallowed by the same dust. A storm had passed not long before, leaving the air thick with the scent of rain that never truly came. The ground bore the memory of it, hard and cracked, yet glistening faintly like old scars. Somewhere far off, a river murmured through the canyon, but its sound was faint, like the echo of something half-dead and dreaming. And there, in the middle of all that nothing, the remnants of a campfire still smoldered, a faint curl of smoke rising like a ghost sigh into the fading light. The ashes glowed soft and orange, fragile as breath. Beside them, a length of broken chain lay half-buried in the dirt, one end rusted, the other clean where it had been snapped. The wind tugged at it, making it clink against a stone. A lonely sound, hollow and human somehow. Far off, a coyote called once, sharp and haunting. Then silence folded back over the land. The world seemed to be holding its breath. It was a place forgotten by mercy, a place where the living moved like shadows and the dead refused to rest. And in that silence, something shifted. The horizon quivered with heat, and through it rode a figure, small at first, then growing clearer against the burning sky. A man, alone, his coat heavy with dust, his hat brim shadowing eyes that had seen too much of war and not enough of peace. His horse's hooves stirred the earth in slow rhythm, each step an echo of a long road behind him. The man rode like someone chasing nothing, or maybe running from everything. The sun caught the edge of his rifle, flaring once before sinking behind the hills. Night began to crawl in slow, certain, and cold. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere ahead, among the ashes and the broken chain, fate had already started breathing again. The desert had been waiting. The rider slowed when he saw the smoke, thin and trembling, rising from the bones of what had once been a campfire. His horse snorted, uneasy, hooves shifting in the dust as if the ground itself carried ghosts. He scanned the emptiness, one hand resting on the worn leather of his rifle strap, the other shading his eyes from the dying sun. At first, there was nothing, only wind and the soft clatter of loose metal. Then he saw it, a shape lying half in shadow, half in the red wash of dusk. He dismounted slow, boots sinking into the soft dirt. The air felt different here, heavy, like the world was holding something it didn't know how to let go of. He moved closer, the tails of his coat brushing against the dry grass. She was there, a woman, maybe 20-something, maybe younger. It was hard to tell beneath the dust and blood and the tangle of dark hair that clung to her face. Her wrists were raw where the chain had been, her skin bruised, her lips cracked from thirst. A torn shawl clung to her shoulders. One side burned from the fire that had almost reached her. For a moment, he just stood over her, caught between disbelief and something deeper. A quiet ache that stirred beneath the armor he'd built around himself. Then, without a word, he knelt. He reached for the canteen at his belt, unscrewing it with hands that trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from the memory of what it meant to care. He lifted her head gently, water touching her lips like a prayer. She stirred, a faint breath escaping her, and for the first time her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, not like the sky, but like the soil after rain, full of something alive trying hard not to die. She looked at him, confused, half afraid. He didn't speak. Words would have felt too loud here, too clumsy. Instead, he slipped his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around her small frame. The fabric swallowed her, but she didn't resist. He glanced at the chain, then at her wrists. A faint anger flickered behind his calm. He pulled a small knife from his boot and worked the lock free. The sound of the chain falling, that faint metallic sigh, cut through the stillness like a promise being broken and remade. Her breathing steadied. The color of her skin began to return, slow as sunrise. He looked out toward the horizon, then back at her, as if weighing the long miles he'd already ridden against the single moment now sitting in front of him. Finally, he spoke. A single word, soft as dust. Easy. She blinked once, maybe in understanding, maybe in trust. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, like someone the world had nearly forgotten to keep. As he placed her across the saddle, the last of the light died behind them. The sky turned the color of cold iron. And for the first time in a long while, the cowboy rode not away from something, but toward it. The cabin stood at the edge of nowhere, a crooked thing of timber and tin, half swallowed by sagebrush and wind. Smoke curled from its chimney in thin ribbons, the kind that meant life, not warmth. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of pine, ash, and something simmering slow on the stove. He had carried her there the night he found her, wrapped in his coat like something too fragile for the dark. Now, days later, she was sitting upright, still quiet, still wary, but breathing easier. The man moved about the cabin without a word. Every motion was careful, deliberate, the rhythm of someone who had lived long in silence and found it safer than speech. He filled a tin cup with water from the kettle and set it on the table near her hand. Steam rose between them, curling soft like a question neither of them dared ask. She didn't reach for it at first, just watched him with those dark, uncertain eyes. Then, slowly, her fingers brushed the rim, and she drank. He turned away, pretending not to notice how her hands still trembled. Later, he mended her torn shawl by lantern light. His stitches were rough, but steady soldier's work, not tailor's. The glow from the lamp flickered across the walls, painting both their faces in soft amber. She watched him for a long while, her gaze tracing the quiet strength in his hands, the way his jaw set with focus. He didn't look up until he was done. Then he folded the cloth, set it beside her, and nodded once. No words passed. None were needed. That night, he lit the fire and sat across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. The flames cracked low, throwing red light against the wooden floor. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters, but inside the world felt small, almost kind. She dozed by the hearth, her face turned toward the warmth. When her head slipped sideways, he rose and adjusted the blanket over her shoulders. His fingers brushed the edge of her hair, a ghost of touch, then retreated like it never happened. Days fell into a quiet rhythm. He chopped wood. She gathered what she could from the creek bed. He cooked, she mended. Neither spoke much, but the silence changed shape, no longer sharp, just deep. One afternoon, as he fixed a broken chair by the window, she came beside him and held the leg steady. Their hands met briefly over the worn wood. She didn't pull away this time. Outside, the wind swept through the grass, whispering low. Inside, the fire burned steady, its light reflected in two pairs of eyes that had finally begun to trust the stillness. And when night came again, the sound of the wind no longer felt lonely. It felt like breath shared between two souls learning how to stay. The days had turned softer, though neither of them said it. Morning light fell through the cabin's single window, spilling gold over the table, over the worn wood, over the space they had both begun to share without knowing it. He was mending a bridle by the door when she found it, a small tin box buried beneath the stove. She had been sweeping when her hand brushed against it, dust rising like memory itself. She hesitated before opening it. Inside lay a single photograph. Faded, edges curling, the image almost lost to time. A woman with a child, both smiling. The soldier beside them, younger, unscarred, and alive in a way he no longer seemed to remember. When he saw her holding it, he froze. The leather strap slipped from his hands. She looked up, not with curiosity, but quiet understanding. "Your family?" she asked, her voice small, rough from disuse. He nodded once. That was all. But in the pause that followed, the silence spoke for him. The sound of gunfire long past, the smell of smoke and iron, the echo of names he'd stopped saying. He took the photo gently, slid it back into the box, and closed the lid as if sealing a wound. That night, while he chopped wood outside, she sat by the fire and traced her own scars, the faint lines around her wrists where the chain had bitten. She wore a necklace now, a small silver feather that hung low against her throat. When he came in, wet with sweat and dust, she caught him looking at it. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "They took everything else." The fire popped, throwing sparks between them. He didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a spent bullet, the brass dulled by years of carrying. He set it on the table between them. "Mine," he said simply. "From the war. The one that didn't kill me." The feather glimmered faintly in the firelight. The bullet caught the same flame. Two pieces of the past, side by side. Pain made visible, equal, and understood. For a while, neither spoke. The fire's crackle filled the space where words might have gone. Then she said, almost to herself, "They left me when the sun fell." He looked up. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, reflecting them like mirrors of another night, another burning. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, low and mournful. Inside, two ghosts of the past sat close enough for the shadows to overlap. He didn't offer comfort. He simply stayed, there in the glow, where silence meant more than pity ever could. And for the first time since the world broke them both, neither one felt entirely alone inside their pain. The first sign came with the dust. A thin, rising column far off across the valley. Too steady to be wind, too sharp to be storm. He saw it from the porch as the sun bled low against the hills. His hand went to the rifle leaning by the door, though he already knew what it meant. Riders. She was inside, mending the same shawl he'd once stitched by lamplight. When he stepped in, she looked up, catching the change in his face before he spoke. "Stay quiet," he said softly, "and don't come to the window." Her fingers froze on the needle. "Who is it?" He didn't answer, only glanced once toward the tin box beneath the stove, as if even the past might tremble. Moments later, 3 riders appeared through the haze. Long coats, long guns, and faces carved from the same stone as the land. They dismounted slow, boots crunching over gravel. The one in front wore a badge dulled by dirt and years. "Evenin', Marshal," the cowboy greeted, voice low, even. "Evenin'," the man replied, his tone careful. "We're looking for someone. A woman. Escaped from a camp near the border 2 days back. Said she's dangerous." The word hung heavy between them, dangerous, like the land itself was listening. The cowboy's jaw tensed. "Ain't seen anyone but dust and coyotes." The marshal studied him. "Funny thing," he said, tilting his hat back. "Your fire smoke's fresh. You been keepin' company out here, Mason?" Her name wasn't mentioned, but her breath caught from behind the wall. He heard it. Faint, like the flick of a moth's wing, but the marshal didn't. Mason forced a small smile. "Fire's for me. Nights get cold." The marshal's gaze drifted past him toward the door. For a moment, it felt like the whole world narrowed to that sliver of wood separating her from the men who would chain her again. Then Mason moved, stepped slightly to the side, blocking the view. "You want coffee? Still hot." The marshal hesitated, then shook his head. "Appreciate it. If you see her, you send word." He tipped his hat, mounted up, and the 3 men rode off, their silhouettes swallowed by the sinking sun. Mason stood watching until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did he turn back. She was there in the doorway, hands trembling, eyes wet not from fear, but from what she'd seen in him. The quiet decision to risk everything for someone he'd barely spoken to. "You lied for me," she whispered. He met her gaze. Didn't feel like a lie. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the echo of the riders into the dark. Inside, the fire crackled low, throwing their shadows close together. Two shapes bound now not by chance, but by choice. The cost of mercy had been set, and he'd paid it without hesitation. The days after the riders came were quieter, though not in the same way as before. The silence between them had changed. It no longer carried fear or distance, but something tender, waiting, almost sacred. The air had turned cold again. Autumn brushed the plains in long strokes of gold and gray, and each evening the wind came down from the ridge carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, a small defiance against the wide, merciless dark. He had been carving something at the table for hours, the soft rasp of his knife cutting through the quiet. She watched from the hearth, her hands busy with mending but her eyes drawn again and again to him, to the way the firelight caught in his hair, to the way his brow furrowed in focus. When he finally set the knife down, he turned the thing over once in his palm, studying it like it was something he wasn't sure he had the right to give. Then he stood and crossed the room. It was a small wooden figure, a bird, wings outstretched, carved from the same pine that lined the walls. Rough but full of care. "It don't fly," he said softly, "but it still remembers how." Her fingers brushed his as she took it. The touch was brief, a single heartbeat, but it lingered longer than any word could have. She looked down at the bird, then up at him, her eyes bright with something unspoken. "I used to dream of flying," she said, "before the chains." He nodded, slow. "Then dream again." The fire cracked behind them, the sound like a sigh. For a long while, they stood there, two quiet figures in the half-light, shadows flickering over the walls like ghosts that had finally learned to rest. Later, she reached for his hand without thinking. Her skin was warm, her grip steady. He didn't pull away. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass. But inside there was only the sound of shared breath and the soft hum of life returning. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman he had rescued, but the one who had rescued him in return. The war inside him went still. She smiled faintly. "You don't have to be alone anymore." The words fell quiet between them, but they landed deep. He exhaled, a sound almost like a laugh, though softer, gentler, like something breaking open that had been locked for years. He reached out, tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, his fingers trembling just enough to prove he was human again. The bird rested between them, wings out, waiting for the dawn. And when the fire burned low, they stayed close, not out of need but out of peace. The kind that comes when two souls stop running and simply decide to stay. The plains woke slow beneath a sky the color of soft gold. The same land that once looked like a wound now shimmered gentle, almost forgiving. The wind still moved across the valley, but it no longer sounded empty. It carried the faint crackle of firewood, the low murmur of voices, and sometimes, laughter. Outside the cabin, smoke rose steady into the morning air, not as a signal of loss this time, but of life. He was at the corral, mending a fence post, while she stood by the porch, her shawl drawn close, the wooden bird resting in her hand. The same wind that once tore through the silence now lifted her hair, brushing it across her face like a tender touch. She looked toward the horizon, where he had once found her broken and the earth had been nothing but dust and memory, and smiled. He caught her gaze, and for a moment, the world slowed. No words passed, none were needed. Between them, the space that once belonged to pain now belonged to peace. A hawk cut across the sky above, wings spread wide, gliding effortless through the same air that had once carried chains and sorrow. She lifted the carved bird slightly, as if offering it to the wind. The air caught it, turned it in her palm, and for the briefest instant, it almost seemed alive. He walked toward her, hands rough, eyes soft. Behind them, the fire inside the cabin glowed, a heartbeat against the dawn. The desert still whispered, but now its voice had changed. The wind still carried dust, but now it carried their laughter too.